I used to think I knew exactly what my life looked like. I had a map, clear, detailed, every road marked in ink I trusted. I knew the sound of my husband's laugh when something genuinely caught him off guard. I knew the way he took his coffee, 2 sugars and just enough cream to turn it the color of sand. I knew the particular creak of the 3rd stair in our house, the one Daniel had been promising to fix for 4 years. I knew, or thought I knew, the shape of us. Claire and Daniel Hartwell, married 7 years, parents of a 3-year-old daughter named Rosie, owners of a slightly overgrown garden and a cat named Fig, who had decided, somewhere around year 2, that he belonged exclusively to Daniel and barely tolerated the rest of us. I knew all of that. What I did not know, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in September, was that when I walked through the glass doors of Hartwell & Associates, carrying a paper bag of still warm pasta and a thermos of the coffee Daniel could never quite replicate at the office, I was about to walk into a version of my life I hadn't been told existed. His assistant looked up at me from behind the reception desk, and her eyes did something I had never seen directed at me before. Not confusion, not polite inquiry, something sharper, more territorial, like a cat that has just noticed a stranger near its food bowl. She was young, mid-20s at most, with the kind of effortless, put-together quality that comes from having no small children at home and 8 full hours of sleep. Her hair was dark, swept back, and she wore a blouse the color of sage that probably cost more than my entire outfit. She looked at the paper bag in my hand. She looked at me. And then she said it, with a light little laugh that was almost worse than if she'd been angry. "And who exactly are you, bringing food to my boyfriend?" The office went quiet in that particular way offices do when something has just happened that no one is supposed to have witnessed, but everyone has. 2 people at nearby desks found sudden, urgent interest in their monitors. A man near the printer stopped mid-reach, and I stood there in the lobby of the company my husband had built, holding pasta that was still warm, and I smiled. Not because I found it funny, not because I was fine, but because in that single suspended second, something inside me clicked into a place so cold and so clear that smiling was the only thing that made sense. I smiled, and I waited, and I thought, let's see exactly how this goes. 3 years is a long time to be away from the working world. I want to be honest about that, because the story I'm telling you didn't start in that lobby. It started much earlier, in the quiet domestic drift that happens to women who step away from careers to raise children, and gradually, without ever deciding to, become slightly invisible to the people who love them most. I had been a project manager before Rosie. A good one, the kind that other teams borrowed for difficult accounts, the kind that got called in when a timeline had collapsed and needed to be rebuilt from rubble. I was organized to a degree that Daniel used to tease me about, leaving color-coded grocery lists on the refrigerator and scheduling dentist appointments 6 months in advance. I liked order. I liked knowing what came next. And for the first 5 years of our marriage, life had obliged me beautifully. Then we decided to have a baby, and then Rosie arrived, 11 days early on a Wednesday in October, and the order I'd built my whole personality around dissolved into something I hadn't been prepared for, the exquisite, exhausting, total chaos of newborn life. I don't say this to complain. Rosie is the best thing I have ever done. But those first months were a reckoning with my own limits, and then those months became a year, and then the pandemic years blurred everything. And then Rosie was 2, and Daniel said, "There's no rush. Take all the time you need." And I believed him because I wanted to. And 3 years passed like water through open hands. During those 3 years, Daniel had grown his company. Hartwell & Associates had been a modest consulting firm when we married, 6 employees, a rented office on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of carpet glue, clients who were mostly referrals from Daniel's university contacts. By the time I stood in that lobby, it occupied the entire 2nd floor of a renovated building in the city center, employed 22 people, and had a name in the industry that meant something. I was proud of him, genuinely, completely proud. I had been the one who talked him through the sleepless nights in year 1 when the first big client threatened to leave. I had been the one who read through contracts at midnight while Rosie slept on my chest. I had made every dinner party, soothed every doubt, rearranged every school holiday plan around his travel schedule, without complaint, because I believed in what we were building, together. That's the word that matters, together. I can trace now, with the horrible clarity of hindsight, the exact points at which together began to quietly mean something else. It wasn't dramatic, it never is, with the slow kinds of betrayal. It was a text message not shown, a dinner meeting that ran longer than expected, a name, Mia, mentioned once in passing and then carefully never mentioned again, which is its own kind of mention if you're paying attention. I hadn't been paying attention. Or rather, I had been paying attention to the wrong things. To Rosie's language development, and the questionable mole on Daniel's shoulder I'd been begging him to get checked, and the slow leak in the upstairs bathroom, and the 100 small administrative tasks of keeping a family alive. I had been so thoroughly occupied with the infrastructure of our life that I had stopped auditing the emotional architecture underneath it. The lunch idea had been my mother's, actually. I'd met her for coffee that Tuesday morning, and she'd asked how Daniel was, and I'd answered on autopilot. Fine, busy, the company's doing really well. And she'd looked at me with the particular look mothers deploy when they're deciding whether to say the thing they're thinking. She said it. When did you last do something spontaneous for him? Something that wasn't about the house or Rosie? I'd started to answer and realized I couldn't remember. Bring him lunch, she said simply. Surprise him. You used to do that. She was right. In the early years, I'd done it often. Shown up with food, just to see his face, just to take 20 minutes in the middle of a hectic day to sit across from each other and remember why we'd chosen this. So I'd stopped at the Italian place 2 blocks from his office, the one he'd always loved, and ordered his usual. And I'd walked through those glass doors with a warm bag and a full thermos and the first genuinely light feeling I'd had in months, and walked straight into a sentence that rearranged everything. Her name, I would learn, was Mia Caldwell. She had been Daniel's personal assistant for 14 months, hired, as it happened, 3 months after I'd mentioned to Daniel that I was starting to feel isolated at home and might look into returning to work part-time. I don't know what to do with that timing, even now. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Mia was 24 years old, had a degree in business administration, and had arrived in my husband's professional life with the particular energy of someone who is very good at making themselves essential. She was also, as I stood there in that lobby, absolutely certain that Daniel Hartwell was her boyfriend. I held her gaze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform distress for the watching office. I simply said, in a tone so even it surprised even me, "My name is Claire Hartwell. I'm Daniel's wife. We have a daughter, and I've brought my husband his lunch." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard since Rosie's first cry. Mia's face did something complicated, a fast, fractured sequence of expressions that moved through confidence, confusion, recalibration, and landed somewhere that looked almost like anger, which told me a great deal about what she had and hadn't been told. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Her eyes moved, just briefly, involuntarily, to the hallway behind her, the hallway that led to Daniel's office, with the particular reflex of someone looking for rescue. She wouldn't find it quickly enough. "Perhaps," I said, still smiling, "you could let Daniel know I'm here." He appeared in the hallway 40 seconds later. I know because I counted. 40 seconds is exactly enough time for an assistant to type a panicked message on an internal system. He was wearing the gray blazer I'd given him for his birthday, and his hair was slightly rumpled in the way it got when he'd been running his hand through it, which he did, I knew, when he was stressed. He was very stressed. He saw me. He saw the bag in my hand. He saw Mia, frozen behind the reception desk, and the color left his face so completely, so rapidly, that the man standing in front of me looked for one lurching moment like a stranger wearing my husband's clothes. "Claire," he said, "just my name, nothing attached to it, no warmth, No surprise, no instinctive smile. Just my name, landing in the air between us like an object dropped from a height. I kept my smile exactly where it was. "I brought you lunch," I said. "The pasta from Marco's. You've been working too hard." The office was very, very quiet. Somewhere a phone rang once and stopped. Daniel looked at Mia. Mia looked at him. And in that exchange, that single, terrible, involuntary exchange of a look between two people who share a secret, I got my confirmation. Not a suspicion, a confirmation. Everything I needed to know was in that 2-second glance. I set the bag on the reception desk. I placed the thermos beside it. I smoothed the front of my jacket with both hands, the way I do when I'm grounding myself, when I need to feel like my own body is solid and present and mine. "We should have dinner tonight," I said to Daniel, and my voice was still perfectly, terrifyingly calm. "Just the two of us. Rosie can stay at my mother's. I'll make a reservation." "Claire, 7 o'clock, I said. "I'll text you where." And then I walked back through the glass doors into the September afternoon, and I sat in my car for 4 minutes, and I did not cry, because the cold, clear thing that had settled in my chest when Mia spoke was still there, hard and precise as a compass needle, pointing me forward. I had 3 hours before I needed to pick up Rosie. 3 hours to find out exactly what had been built in the shadows of my marriage while I'd been busy keeping the lights on. I started making calls. The first call I made was to my best friend Joanna, not because I needed to cry on someone's shoulder, not yet, but because Joanna had been a family law paralegal for 6 years before she switched to HR consulting, and she had the particular skill set of someone who has spent years watching marriages dissolve from a professional distance. She knew what mattered. She knew what to document. And she picked up on the second ring the way she always did, as if she'd been waiting. "Joe," I said. My voice was still steady. I was almost impressed by it. "I need you to think like a paralegal for the next hour, not like my friend. Can you do that?" A pause. "What happened?" I told her, all of it. Mia's words, Daniel's face, the look they'd exchanged. I told it quickly, without editorializing, the way you relay information when you know that emotion will cost you something you can't afford to spend yet. Joanna listened without interrupting, which she almost never does, and when I finished, there was a silence that felt like her assembling pieces into a shape. "Okay," she said finally. "Where are you right now?" "Sitting in my car outside his office." "Drive away from the building first, then we talk." I drove 2 blocks and pulled into the car park of a supermarket I'd been to 100 times, where Rosie had once had a spectacular meltdown over a refused packet of biscuits, and I sat under the familiar fluorescent glow of normalcy and listened to Joanna tell me what I needed to do in the next 3 hours. Her voice was measured and practical, and it was exactly what I needed. Not comfort, not outrage on my behalf, but a clear sequence of steps. She was my compass, too, just a different kind. "First," she said, "you need to know what you're dealing with before you sit across from him at dinner. There's a difference between a husband who made a catastrophic mistake and a husband who has been living a constructed double life. The response to each is different. The legal position is different. The leverage is different." "How do I find out which one it is in 3 hours?" "You probably can't get the full picture in 3 hours," she said honestly, "but you can get enough to walk into that dinner knowing whether you're negotiating or ending. Those are 2 different conversations." She paused. "Do you have access to your joint accounts?" I did. We'd always shared financial management. Or rather, I had always managed it because Daniel found it tedious and I didn't. I knew our accounts the way I knew the house, every room, every corner. "Yes," I said, "log in now while you're on the phone with me. Look for anything irregular in the last 14 months. Restaurants, hotels, transfers you didn't make. Don't look for proof of an affair. Look for evidence of a pattern. A pattern tells you it's not an accident." I opened the banking app. My hands were steady. I have always been able to do the difficult administrative task in the middle of the emotional crisis. It's a quality I used to consider a strength and had lately started to wonder about. The account loaded. I started scrolling. It took me less than 4 minutes to find the first hotel charge, a place called the Meridian, a boutique hotel in the city's West Quarter, 14 months ago, 2 nights. The amount was specific enough to mean a double room, specific enough to mean dinner, specific enough to mean this wasn't a client meeting at a conference center. I scrolled further. The Meridian appeared again 3 months later, then a different hotel, smaller, further from the city, the kind of place chosen for discretion rather than comfort. Then a restaurant I didn't recognize, a Tuesday evening 8 months ago, when Daniel had told me he was at a client dinner and had come home smelling of wine and had been unusually tender with Rosie when he put her to bed, had stood in the doorway of her room for longer than usual, and I had thought at the time that something had moved him that day, some unexpected tenderness toward his life. I had found it sweet. I relayed everything to Joanna in a voice that had gone very quiet. "Okay," she said, and her tone had shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to hear it. "Claire, this is not a single mistake." "No," I said. "It isn't. You know what that means." "It means I'm not going to dinner to negotiate," I said. "I'm going to dinner to decide." There was a pause in which she understood exactly what I meant, and I understood it too, and we sat with that understanding for a moment, like two people acknowledging that the weather has definitively changed, and no amount of hoping will bring back the morning. "Do you want me to come with you tonight?" she asked. "Not to the dinner, but after. To your place or mine, wherever you land." "Yes," I said, "but not before. I need to do this part alone." I spent the next 2 hours in a state of absolute terrible calm. I drove to the school to pick up Rosie at the normal time, and I held her hand in the car park and listened to her explain with great seriousness that her friend Bethany had a hamster called Spaghetti, and that we needed one immediately, and that she would take full responsibility for its care. I said I would think about it. I carried her inside our house and made her a snack and sat with her while she ate it, and I watched her, the particular earnest way she ate crackers, one at a time, examining each one before it went in her mouth, as though quality control were essential. And I felt something so vast and unnameable move through my chest that I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a moment and stand at the sink and breathe. Everything I was about to do, I was doing for her. Not out of revenge, not out of wounded pride, though both of those were present, I won't pretend otherwise. But underneath them, solid and immovable as the foundations of the house, was the simple fact of Rosie at the kitchen table examining crackers, and the life she deserved, and the truth she would someday ask me for. My mother arrived at 6 to take Rosie for the night. I had called her after Joanna, and she had asked no questions, which is its own kind of eloquence. She took Rosie's overnight bag, scooped my daughter into a hug that Rosie accepted with the distracted tolerance of a child whose grandmother's embraces are simply part of the furniture of life, and she paused at the door and looked at me. Really looked at me. The way she had when I was 17 and had shown up at her bedroom door at midnight, knowing something was wrong, without yet knowing what. "You're going to be all right," she said. Not a question. "I know," I said. I believed it, which surprised me a little, but the cold, clear thing in my chest had not moved. If anything, it had settled deeper, become more structural, less like a reaction and more like a resolve. I chose the restaurant deliberately, not somewhere we'd been together, not somewhere with the soft ballast of shared memories that might confuse the emotional acoustics of what I needed to say. I chose a place called Archer's, quiet and well-lit and professional, the kind of restaurant where people conduct difficult conversations in low voices, and the tables are far enough apart to provide the illusion of privacy. I arrived 8 minutes early and ordered still water, and sat with my back to the wall, an old habit. Joanna had once told me I had the spatial instincts of someone expecting an ambush, and I watched the door. Daniel arrived at 7:03. He had changed out of the gray blazer into a dark jacket I didn't recognize, and his hair was properly combed now, which told me he'd had time to compose himself, to decide on an approach. He was preparing for something. The question was whether he'd chosen confession or defense, and I'd know in the first 30 seconds from the way he sat down. He sat down carefully, in the particular way of someone lowering themselves onto uncertain ground, and he reached across the table, instinctively, a muscle memory of intimacy, and then stopped, his hand hovering, rerouting to the water glass instead. Defense, then, not confession. "Claire," he said. His voice had the measured quality of something rehearsed. "I know what it must have looked like." "Daniel," my voice was quiet. "Before you tell me what it looked like, I want to tell you what I found." Something shifted in his face. His jaw tightened fractionally, the way it does when he's recalibrating. I told him. The hotels, the dates, the restaurant on the Tuesday he'd told me he was with a client. I told him each item in sequence, my voice never rising, never breaking, and I watched each one land on him like something physical, a slight flinch, a fractional dimming of the practiced composure he'd walked in wearing. By the time I finished, the composure was mostly gone. "I wasn't going to," he started. "Don't tell me what you weren't going to do," I said. "Tell me when it started. Tell me that much honestly." The pause that followed was long enough that the waiter appeared, took one look at the atmosphere, and retreated without taking our order. 14 months ago, Daniel said. His voice had changed, the rehearsed quality gone, replaced by something rougher, more honest, which paradoxically made it harder to hear. "After the Andrews account, the night I came home late and you were already asleep." I remembered that night. I'd been exhausted. Rosie had been cutting molars, 3 days of broken nights, and I'd fallen asleep at 9:30 in my clothes and woken to find Daniel beside me, already dressed for the next morning. I had thought he'd covered me with the blanket. I had found that tender. The world is full of details that look like one thing and are another. "She was at the client dinner," he continued. "She'd just started with the company, and He stopped, ran his hand through his hair, the gesture I knew, the tell, the stress marker, and looked at the table. It was one drink, and then it wasn't. "Did she know about me?" I asked. "Did she know about Rosie?" The pause before his answer was its own kind of answer. "Daniel, I told her the marriage was..." He stopped again. "What?" My voice was very still. "What did you tell her the marriage was?" He looked up at me then, and in his face I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of weariness, as though he'd been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and some part of him was almost relieved to put it down, even in the worst possible way. "I told her things weren't good between us," he said, "that we'd grown apart, that I was trying to figure out how to..." He exhaled. "I didn't tell her it was over, but I let her believe it might be." "You let her believe," I repeated. "So she genuinely thought she was your girlfriend." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was a complete sentence. I sat with that for a moment. The candlelight moved between us. Somewhere behind me, people were having a normal dinner, laughing at something, ordering dessert, existing in the version of Tuesday evening where this wasn't happening. I could hear them, muffled and warm, like a life observed through glass. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, because I'm going to find out the truth regardless, and the only thing that changes based on your answer is whether I believe you still have the capacity for honesty." He looked at me, nodded. "Did you tell her about the house?" Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted differently, not with shame, but with something more like caution, a person choosing their words near a cliff edge. "What do you mean?" "The house is in my name, Daniel. You know that. When we bought it, your credit rating made it cleaner for the mortgage to be in my name alone, and we never transferred it because it was never necessary, because I trusted..." I stopped, reset. "Did you have any conversations with Mia about the property, about our financial arrangements, about anything that would require her to understand how our assets are structured?" The pause this time was the longest yet. And that pause, reader, that specific, particular, measuring pause, that was the moment I understood that the problem was larger than an affair. Daniel's pause stretched long enough to become a wall between us. I watched him decide. I could actually see it, the way you can sometimes see weather change over open water, the light shifting, something gathering. He was deciding how much I already knew. He was calculating. And the fact that he was calculating, rather than simply answering, told me that the answer was going to require damage control. We talked about a lot of things, he said finally, the careful phrasing of someone who has been cornered but hasn't yet conceded the territory. That's not an answer. Claire, did you discuss the house with her? Yes or no? He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking from it, a gesture I recognized as displacement, something to do with his hands when his mind was working somewhere else. She asked questions, he said at last, about how things were structured, between us financially. I didn't think I wasn't giving her anything. She was curious, and You answered, I said. You told a woman who believed she was your girlfriend the details of how our marital assets are structured, the house, the accounts, who owns what. He said nothing. Daniel, I leaned forward slightly. Why would she need to know that? Why would any of that be relevant to... What did you think that was? What did you think she was going to do with that information? And there it was again, that pause. That specific, terrible pause that meant he had thought about it. He had wondered. He had noticed something and filed it in a drawer he hadn't wanted to open because opening it would require him to confront something about Mia that was more complicated than the convenient story he'd been telling himself. The story where he was simply a weak man who had made a mistake, caught between two women, helpless and hapless, and ultimately sympathetic. That story required Mia to be a simple variable, a young woman who had feelings for him, uncomplicated, manageable, a personal problem rather than a structural one. But she'd asked about the house. I don't know why she asked, he said, and for the first time that evening, I thought he might be telling the truth, or at least a truth, the particular truth of a man who has been willfully incurious because the answers would complicate his comfort. I sat back. The candle between us guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere, recovered, burned on. I need you to tell me everything, I said. Not a version, not a curated account. Everything she asked, everything you told her, every conversation that touched on money or property or our legal arrangements, from the beginning. Tonight? Yes, tonight. I paused. Because tomorrow morning I am meeting with a solicitor, and I need to know what I'm walking into. The word solicitor landed between us with a finality that changed the temperature of the conversation. Daniel's face did something that looked almost like grief. Not the performative grief of someone who's sorry they've been caught, but something quieter, more genuine, like a person watching a structure they built with their own hands begin to list. I might have felt something for that grief, in a different evening, in a different version of this conversation. I did feel something, actually. I won't pretend the 7 years between us had simply evaporated, but the feeling was far away, observed rather than inhabited, like a landscape seen from a moving train. She asked, he said slowly, whether the house could be sold without your agreement if we separated. He stopped. She framed it as hypothetical, like she was just thinking ahead, she said. Planning, she called it. The cold thing in my chest hardened another degree. She called it planning. I told her it couldn't, that it was in your name. He paused. I noticed she seemed frustrated by that, but she didn't say anything else, and I told myself I was reading too much into it. Another pause. I was reading too much into it. Were you? I said quietly, or were you reading exactly the right amount and choosing not to act on it? He had no answer for that. I thought about Mia standing at that reception desk, her easy confidence, the light little laugh she'd deployed when she asked who I was. I thought about 14 months. I thought about a woman who asks detailed questions about marital property, who asks how assets are structured, who asks whether a house can be sold without a wife's consent, and the story that requires that information to make sense. Not the story of a woman who has simply fallen for a taken man. A different story. a more deliberate one. "I need to ask you one more thing tonight," I said, "and then I need to go home and think, and you need to give me space to do that. Agreed?" He nodded. "Has she ever been to our house?" The pause was shorter this time, barely 2 seconds, but 2 seconds in a marriage can contain multitudes. "Once," he said, 7 months ago. You were at your mother's with Rosie for the weekend. She came over." He looked at the table. "It was a mistake. I knew it at the time. I didn't—" "She was in our house," I said, not as an accusation, more as a person reading a map, confirming a location. "She was in the house that is in my name, the house where my daughter lives, and she had already been asking questions about whether it could be sold without my consent." The way he looked at me then, the dawning, horrible recognition in his expression, told me he had never assembled those facts into that sentence before. He had kept them in separate compartments, the way people keep things that are too difficult to face when placed in proximity to each other. But now they were in proximity. Now they were adjacent. And the picture they made together was not the picture of a simple, ordinary affair. "Oh God," he said quietly. Just that. 2 words, with a weight that was almost satisfying in its completeness. "Yes," I said. I folded my napkin. I stood up. "Oh God is right." I called Joanna from the car. She answered before the second ring, which told me she'd been holding her phone. "Well," she said. "I need you to find out everything you can about Mia Caldwell," I said. "Full name, background, previous employment, whether she has any connection to property law, real estate, financial services, anything." A beat. "You think this isn't just an affair?" "I think a 24-year-old woman who has been sleeping with a married man for 14 months and asking detailed questions about his wife's sole ownership of the marital property is not operating on pure romantic impulse," I said. "But I want facts, not instinct." "I'll start tonight," Joanna said without hesitation. "What did Daniel say?" "He confirmed most of what I needed to know without understanding what he was confirming," I said. "He thought he was confessing to an affair. I think he was actually describing the operational phase of something else." The silence on her end was the sound of a careful person taking something very seriously. "Claire," she said slowly, "if this is what you think it might be, then I need to move faster than they're expecting," I said. "And I need to be much quieter about it than they're expecting, too. Come to mine tonight. We'll work through it properly." I drove to Joanna's with the particular focused clarity of a person who has moved past shock and grief and arrived somewhere colder and more useful. Her flat was on the 4th floor of a building near the river, warm and familiar, full of books she'd read twice and plants that thrived under her, contrary to all expectation. She opened the door with her laptop already open and a legal pad already covered in her neat, precise handwriting, and she handed me a glass of wine I didn't drink and sat me down, and we worked. What Joanna found in 2 hours of careful searching was this. Mia Caldwell had worked for 3 employers in the 5 years before Hartwell and Associates. 2 of them were unremarkable, entry-level administrative roles, nothing notable. The third was a small property consultancy called Greystone Advisory that had operated for 18 months before dissolving 3 years ago. Greystone Advisory had been investigated by the Financial Conduct Authority for practices relating to the inappropriate transfer of property assets, specifically facilitating the transfer of jointly held or sole ownership properties through what the FCA report described as relationships of influence. The investigation had been closed without prosecution due to insufficient evidence, but the firm had dissolved shortly afterward, and several of its principals had quietly dispersed into adjacent industries. Mia Caldwell had been a junior administrator at Greystone. She was 21 at the time. Joanna read this aloud to me in the measured voice she used when the information was significant enough that she didn't want her own reaction to color my reception of it. When she finished, she looked up. "Junior administrator," she said, which means she wasn't the architect, but she was inside it. She knew what the firm did. She knew what the model looked like, I said. Yes. We looked at each other across her kitchen table in the lamplight. Outside, the river was dark and unhurried, indifferent to what was being assembled in the warm room above it. Relationships of influence, I said slowly. That's what the FCA report called it. That's the polite version, Joanna said. What it means in practice is you cultivate a relationship with someone who has access to assets you want to reach. You use the relationship to gather information, ownership structure, legal position, vulnerabilities. And then, when you have enough information, you use the relationship as leverage to facilitate a transfer. Through persuasion, legal pressure, manufactured circumstances, or, in some documented cases, by constructing a situation where the asset holder becomes motivated to sell or transfer voluntarily. Manufactured circumstances, I repeated, like a wife who discovers an affair and is emotionally compromised enough to make rushed decisions about marital property? Joanna was quiet for a moment. That would be one interpretation, she said carefully. I thought about standing in that lobby, about Mia's light little laugh, and who exactly are you bringing food to my boyfriend? I had thought it was carelessness, the thoughtless territorial display of a young woman who hadn't expected to be confronted. But what if it wasn't carelessness? What if the confrontation in the lobby, with witnesses in a professional setting, was precisely calibrated? What if being seen, being known, was the point? What if the desired outcome was exactly what had happened? A wife finding out, a marriage rupturing, a woman making decisions in a state of devastation. "Joe," I said slowly, "what if she wanted me to find out?" Joanna set her pen down. "Explain." "She could have hidden it. He clearly wanted it hidden. He went pale when I walked through the door. But she announced it. In the lobby, in front of witnesses, as soon as she saw me." I paused. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked ready. "She might not have known who you were," Joanna said, but her voice carried the slight upward inflection of someone voicing a counter-argument they don't fully endorse. "Or she recognized me and made a choice," I said, "and the choice was, blow this open now, on my terms, in a setting where everyone hears it, where the wife is publicly humiliated and emotionally destabilized and walks out of a marriage she only half understood." I paused. A wife who might then, in the next 6 to 12 months, want to sell the house and divide the assets and close the chapter and start over. The room was very quiet. "That's a significant theory," Joanna said. "I know. It would mean this was never primarily about Daniel." "No," I said. "Daniel was a tool, a useful, willing, emotionally available tool who happened to be married to a woman who owns a property in a city where property values have increased 40% in 5 years. Joanna picked up her pen. She wrote something on the legal pad, slowly, deliberately. She turned it around and slid it across the table toward me. She had written 2 words: "Get evidence." I looked at it. I looked at her. "I know," I said. "I know exactly where to start." I drove home at midnight through streets that felt unfamiliar and newly legible, as though a layer of something had been stripped away and I was seeing the infrastructure for the first time, the wiring behind the walls, the load-bearing beams behind the plaster. The house was dark when I arrived. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular silence of a home without its child, and I felt the shape of it around me. My name on the deed, my signature on the mortgage, my life in every corner. And I thought, no, not this. This is mine. I went to Daniel's desk in the study. He kept it organized in the loose, approximate way of someone who is not naturally tidy, but makes a reasonable effort. Papers in rough categories, folders labeled in his handwriting, the kind of functional order that isn't designed to withstand scrutiny. I wasn't looking for anything specific yet. I was looking for anything that shouldn't be there, anything that bore Mia's fingerprints, metaphorically or otherwise, anything that suggested the conversation about our assets had moved beyond conversation. The study was quiet. The lamp on the desk threw a small, warm circle of light, and in the third drawer, beneath a folder of receipts Danielle kept for accounting purposes and a conference lanyard from 2 years ago, I found an envelope, plain, white, unsealed. My name wasn't on it. Daniel's wasn't either. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed, not handwritten, a clean, professional font, the kind of formatting that signals someone who knows how documents should look. It was a draft of a letter from Daniel, addressed to our mortgage provider, requesting information about the process for transfer of sole ownership to joint ownership. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago. I stood at the desk in the lamplight and read it twice. Then I took out my phone and photographed it. Then I replaced it, exactly as I'd found it, and closed the drawer. I stood for a long moment in the quiet study. The cat, Fig, appeared in the doorway and regarded me with the mild suspicion he generally applied to human behavior after midnight, then retreated. The house settled around me, its familiar sounds, the distant hum of the boiler, the faint creak of the upstairs landing, surrounding me like evidence of ownership. My hands were perfectly still. I went to bed. I set my alarm for 6, and I lay in the dark in the house with my name on the deed and thought, with cold and absolute clarity, about everything I was going to do next. I was at Helen Marsh's office by 8:15. She was my solicitor, silver-haired, precise, the kind of woman who has spent decades in rooms where every word costs something. I had used her once before and kept her number the way you keep a fire extinguisher, hoping you'll never need it, grateful it exists. I put the photographs of the draft letter on her desk and told her everything. The affair, the hotel receipts, Mia's questions about the property, the Greystone advisory background, the FCA investigation, the lobby confrontation, all of it in sequence without editorializing. Helen listened without interrupting. She made 3 notes. Then she looked up. "The house is protected as long as your name is the sole name on the title," she said. "Nothing can happen around you, only through you. That's your strongest position." She paused. "Don't confront Mia yet. Don't tell Daniel what you know about her background. Let him believe this is still about the affair. A man who doesn't know the full picture behaves differently from one who does. Watch him. Let him talk." "How long before the draft letter becomes something more?" I asked. "Depends on how impatient they are," she said. "But if they know you found out about the affair, the timeline may accelerate. A destabilized person makes faster decisions. That may be exactly what yesterday's lobby confrontation was designed to produce." She paused. "So appear more destabilized than you are." I nodded. She had arrived, independently, at the same place Joanna and I had reached the night before. When Daniel came downstairs at 9:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, my expression arranged into something tired and sad and just fragile enough. Not broken, not the face of a woman who had spent the morning with a solicitor. He looked terrible. He sat across from me and started to speak twice and stopped. Then, "I want to fix this." "I don't know if it can be fixed," I said quietly. "That's honest." We talked. I asked him carefully, without revealing what I knew, about what Mia expected now that everything was in the open. He turned his mug in his hands and said she had told him 2 months ago that she didn't want to be a secret anymore, that she needed to know if there was a future, that he'd told her he needed time. "What did she say when you said that?" I asked. He paused and something crossed his face, a faint unease, a memory rearranging itself in retrospect. She said, "Don't worry, I'm patient. I play a long game." The kitchen was very still. He hadn't registered what he'd just told me, but I had. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. Not forgiveness, but alliance. "I need you to go into the office today," I said. "Be normal with her, warm, exactly as you have been. Give me 48 hours. "Why?" "Because I think she's going to contact you today," I said. "And what she says will tell us both something important." He looked at me for a long moment. "You know something you're not telling me." I know several things, I said honestly. In 48 hours, I'll tell you all of them. He texted at 2:17. She wants to meet after work, said it's urgent, talking about next steps. He recorded the meeting. He came home at 7:30 and sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, not at the table, on the floor, which told me everything about how it had landed, and looked up at me and said, she knew about the letter, the mortgage transfer. She called it a timeline, said she'd done groundwork and didn't want it wasted. He exhaled. And then she said if I wasn't prepared to move forward, she had other options. Company records she'd been going through for months. Financial irregularities, she said. Small things, she said, but uncomfortable ones. He placed his phone on the kitchen counter. The recording. I looked at him on the floor of our kitchen, the gray blazer rumpled, his face carrying the specific devastation of a man who has just understood he was never the hunter in this story. He was the terrain through which someone else hunted. I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction, something smaller and more complicated than that. The reluctant human acknowledgement of watching someone understand they've been used and finding that the person on the floor is still someone you once loved and the look on their face still costs you something. Get up, I said. Sit at the table. I'll make tea, and then I'll tell you everything. He sat. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has finally run out of the defenses that were keeping the full weight of his choices at a manageable distance. You've been planning since yesterday, he said. Since the car park outside the supermarket, I said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but its outline. The one near the office? I needed somewhere ordinary, I said, to make extraordinary phone calls from. I put the kettle on. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was dark. The third stair creaked as Fig made his nightly circuit of the house, checking that everything was as he'd left it. I poured the tea. Tomorrow, we would finish this. Helen listened to the recording the next morning without expression. 43 minutes of Mia Caldwell's voice, measured, professional, unhurried, laying out timelines and groundwork and other options with the calm of someone who has never once considered that the conversation might be preserved and used against her. When it finished, Helen made 4 notes, set her pen down, and looked at me across the pale oak desk. Blackmail, she said, explicit enough to be actionable. Combined with the Greystone connection and the draft transfer letter, we have pattern and intent across 14 months. That's what prosecutors need. She paused. She was overconfident. That's usually how these unravel. I thought of Mia in the lobby. The light little laugh, the territorial ease of someone who believed the terrain was already hers. Confidence built on a plan that had never encountered friction. She hadn't accounted for the possibility that the wife would walk in calm, walk out calmer, and spend the intervening hours building something she couldn't see coming. We moved that same afternoon. Helen filed the formal referral to the FCA, Mia's name, employment history, the Greystone connection, the recording, the photographed letter, and the 14-month chronology Joanna had assembled across 2 sleepless nights with paralegal precision. I gave a formal statement. I was calm throughout. The calm had long since stopped being an effort and had simply become how I operated now. Daniel called his HR consultant at noon. Mia was placed on administrative leave before lunch, her access to company systems revoked simultaneously. To his credit, once he understood the full shape of what had been constructed around him, he didn't hesitate or deflect. He was pale and hollowed out, and kept saying, I should have seen it, in the voice of someone rehearsing culpability almost compulsively, as though repetition might constitute some form of payment. It wouldn't, but it was honest, and honesty was what I needed from him right now more than anything else. The FCA opened a formal investigation 11 days later. The blackmail referral went to the police the same week. Mia's solicitor issued a statement describing his client as a young woman emotionally misled by an older employer. A swift, complete reframing executed with the fluency of a prepared exit strategy. She had planned for multiple outcomes. She simply hadn't planned for the one where the wife didn't break. The conversation with Daniel happened in pieces over several weeks, at the kitchen table late at night, in the car on the motorway once, radio off, the enforced proximity that makes honesty easier. In the garden on a cold October afternoon, while Rosie watched television inside, and the oak tree he'd planted the year we moved in shed its leaves with the indifference of something that has weathered worse. He hadn't known about Greystone. He hadn't understood that Mia's questions about the property were anything beyond the curiosity of a woman building a future she expected to inhabit. He had been the access point, not the architect. The door left open by weakness and vanity and the human tendency to avoid questions whose answers might be inconvenient. That didn't make what he had done less than it was. It located it accurately, which was different from excusing it. And the difference mattered for what came next. He told me the draft letter had not been written by him. Mia had placed it in his desk drawer herself during an afternoon when she had building access and his professional trust, and his guilt making him slower to notice than he should have been. She had written it in his name and positioned it where she calculated I would find it, knowing, somehow, the kind of person I was, knowing I would look. She underestimated one thing, I said. What? She thought finding it would break me, I said. She thought the affair plus the letter would send me into the kind of desperate decision-making she could steer. Sell the house, divide everything, sign whatever was in front of me to close the chapter. I paused. She didn't account for the possibility that I would find it and simply get colder. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. I've always known that about you, he said quietly. I should have remembered it was one of the reasons I married you. What came after was not simple. A marriage that survives something like this doesn't emerge unchanged. It emerges as a different thing, with new weight in some places and permanent gaps in others. We were both altered. Some of what changed was real, unrecoverable loss, the particular innocence of trusting without evidence. The version of Daniel I had believed I knew completely, replaced by a more accurate and more complicated version I was still learning to read. Some of what changed was not loss. A clarity, a precision, the slower, more effortful conversations of people who have learned that assumption is a luxury. It was harder. It was also, in ways I hadn't anticipated, more real. I went back to work in January. The firm that had interviewed me 3 years ago still had my details, and the offer was better than the original. I sat at my new desk on the first Monday and felt the particular sensation of a person re-entering a space that had been waiting for them. I thought of my mother's advice over coffee in September. Bring him lunch. You used to do that. She had meant it as a small gesture of reconnection. She had not meant it as the mechanism by which 14 months of a carefully constructed scheme would come apart. But that is what it was, the small, ordinary thing that moved everything else. Rosie's campaign for Spaghetti the hamster continued without signs of surrender. Daniel and I had begun exchanging looks across the dinner table when she made her arguments, the conspiratorial look of two parents being outmaneuvered by a 3-year-old. And those looks contained something light and shared that I held on to the way you hold something warm in cold weather. The third stair still creaked. I had stopped minding. One morning in March, I came downstairs before anyone else and stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and looked out at the garden. Still overgrown, still imperfect, the oak tree bare against a pale sky. The same garden I had looked at 1,000 mornings without really seeing, because it had simply been the background of my life, rather than the thing itself. I saw it that morning. I felt the house around me, the third stair, the cat upstairs, my daughter in her room, my name on the deed. Everything I had almost lost and hadn't. Everything I had fought for, quietly, coldly, without drama, in car parks and solicitors' offices, and late-night kitchen conversations that nobody would ever make a story out of, but that had held the whole structure together anyway. Mia had called it a long game. She had played one. Patient, methodical, professionally constructed. She had simply miscalculated the other player at the table. That's the thing about playing a long game. You have to make sure you're the one who decides when it ends. I decided.